Chapter 19. One thing Zorian found interesting about the restarts was that small, seemingly inconsequential choices exerted incredible influence on what happened in the restart. Conversely, actions that he felt should throw everything out of whack often tended to have muted, or even non-existent effects. Case in point, the last time he had gone into the sewers to meet the matriarch, convincing Ilsa to grant him an access permit to enter the sewers had been trivial. Thus, when Zorian marched into Ilsa's office a few days after the beginning of classes, after he realized Zack had decided to give up on befriending him in this particular restart, he expected the request to be easily granted. He was wrong. No matter how much he reasoned and pleaded, Ilsa refused to allow a newly minted mage like him to risk his life in the underworld. He tried to demonstrate his, at this point rather advanced, combat magic skills, but Ilsa wasn't interested and simply shooed him out of her office. It took nearly an hour for Zorian to calm down and realize what the difference was. Last time he came with Kale, a self-taught genius mage who was also a single parent and had probably dealt with danger before in his life. If Kale thought Zorian was ready to go down into the tunnels beneath the city and was willing to accompany him to boot to make sure he was safe, then that was good enough for Ilsa. This time he came alone, though. No Kale, no permit. Not that Zorian was going to be deterred by such a minor setback, of course. He knew at least one person who already had a permit to go down there and might be persuaded to help him. Roach, I hate you. You do know that, right? Zorian released a long-suffering sigh, opting to keep an eye on the tunnel in front of him instead of turning around to look at Taven. He didn't need to turn around to know she was making faces at him. No, Taven, I don't. After all, you only told me so 5 times already. Maybe I'll remember it if you say it a few times more? I just don't get it, Taven complained, ignoring his sarcasm. You refused to follow me down here when I asked you, saying it's too dangerous. And then you come back to me a few days later, asking me to take you into the tunnels. Yes, and he was very much regretting it. Why couldn't she have waited by the entrance like he had asked her to? He still didn't know how he was going to explain Urania to her when they found the damn spiders. Hopefully the Urania would be savvy enough to hide in the shadows while he talked to them telepathically, kind of a hassle, but should be enough to arrange a proper meeting in the future somewhere more accessible. I mean, were you trying to piss me off? Taven continued, undeterred by his lack of response. Because I'm feeling pretty angry right now, let me tell you. Taven, please, Zorian pleaded. I said I was sorry. How many times do I have to apologize? You of all people should understand, considering how many times you pulled stuff like this on me. Not quite like this, Taven grumbled. At least tell me where we're going. I actually don't know, admitted Zorian. He was relying on one of the Urania scouts inadvertently contacting him by trying to read his mind, since he had no real idea where their home territory was. I'll know it when I see it, though. Zorian, I swear, if this is your idea of a prank dash. I'm totally serious, Zorian assured her. I'm pretty sure we're getting close, it shouldn't take 2 dash. An alien presence skittered across the surface of his mind, withdrawing immediately when it realized its intrusion was detected. Its telepathic touch wasn't as subtle as that of the matriarch, but Zorian definitely received an Urania feel from it. Wait, he protested, hoping that the Urania hadn't physically fled already. I want to talk to you, Urania. I have important information for your matriarch. Zorian, what the hell are you talking about? Taven asked, thoroughly baffled at his actions. And who are you talking to, anyway? There is no one here. Zorian said nothing, choosing to wait in silence for a while. Seconds passed in utter silence as Zorian patiently waited for a response from the spider. Taven seemed to be torn between feeling irritation at his behavior and agitation at the potentially dangerous situation. Eventually, the Urania decided to reinitiate contact by stepping into the open right in front of him and Taven. Taven gasped in shock at the appearance of the huge hairy spider and immediately moved to draw her spell rod, only for Zorian to snatch her by her wrist and motion her to stand down. She gave him a baffled look before glancing at the spider in front of them. The Urania stood motionless, observing them silently with its huge pitch-black eyes but not making any threatening gestures. Taven seemed to realize that the spider was no threat at the moment and relaxed, moving her hand away from the spell rod attached to her hip. "Zorian," she began, radiating a mixture of anger and worry at him. "I'll explain later, I promise," Zorian said with a sigh before turning to deal with the Urania. "And you? Couldn't you have been a little more discreet? Why couldn't you have stayed in the shadows and contacted me telepathically?" The Urania reconnected to his mind and sent a burst of amusement at him. "If you wanted to speak to me telepathically, why haven't you called out to me telepathically to begin with? Aren't you psychic yourself?" Zorian grimaced. If only it was that easy. Finding information about mind magic from his fellow mages was like pulling teeth, since the Mage Guild took a very dim view on mind magic of any sort, no matter how benign. Nobody could tell him what being psychic meant, much less teach him how to telepathically contact someone. He did track down a spell that allowed a mage to establish a telepathic connection with someone, but the spell was painfully crude, it worked only on other humans, the target had to be willing and able to lower their spell resistance, and the link only allowed word communication devoid of emotional and other connotations. "I am untrained," admitted Zorian. "I don't know how to contact someone telepathically. I only know how to piggyback answers on a connection someone else made." He wondered about that, actually. Nobody taught him how to do that, yet the concept seemed to come naturally to him. Is this what it meant to be psychic? Perhaps being psychic simply meant he was some sort of instinctive mind mage with inborn skills in the field. "That's so sad," the Urania said. "You are incomplete. But I suppose it could always be worse. You could be a flicker mind like your friend there." Zorian glanced at Taven, suppressing a snort of amusement. It was a good thing he was talking to the Urania telepathically, because he could just imagine how Taven would react if someone called her a flicker mind. "What?" Taven asked, apparently having noticed his look. "Nothing," Zorian mumbled, shaking his head. "Miss Urania, You are a miss, right?" It was hard to tell, but he was pretty sure the Urania he was talking to had a female feel to her. Plus, the Urania were led by a matriarch, so it would make sense for outsiders like him to mostly meet the female members of the species. "All Urania are female," the spider said. "What, really?" Zorian asked. "How on earth does that work? Do you just divide like microbes or spontaneously get pregnant or what?" "Nothing that exotic. It's just that our species is extremely sexually dimorphic, and the males are both smaller in stature and pretty much subsentient. We don't consider them real Urania," the spider explained. "If you talk to one of us and they're smart enough to talk back, they're female. The males would probably attack you in lieu of conversation, though you're unlikely to ever meet one unless you somehow gain access to one of our settlements." Zorian digested that information for a few moments and then decided not to ask any further questions on the topic. It was interesting, but not really relevant at the moment, and he didn't know how long he had before Taven snapped from the pressure and started throwing around spells and demanding answers. She wasn't exactly a paragon of patience. "I'm sorry to be inconsiderate, but I really need to speak to the matriarch," Zorian said, doing his best to reproduce and send the weird Urania Spear of Resolve concept that the matriarch said was her name instead of calling her the matriarch. Hopefully this would help convince the Urania to take him seriously when he told them about memory packets from another timeline. I have been listening to your conversation with watchful eyes that miss nothing of importance. Having the ability to throw your mind to any location inhabited by one of your subordinates must be really convenient. It is, confirmed the matriarch. Now, how about you introduce yourself and tell me how you know my real name? Then we can move on to this important information you have for me. I am Zorian Kaczynski, mage in training, Zorian said. And the reason I know your real name is that you told it to me yourself, right before you shoved a memory packet into my mind and told me to give it to you later. I don't remember that, the matriarch said hesitantly. I know, Zorian said. If you had been able to retain the memory of that encounter, you would not have bothered with putting the memory packet inside my mind. That's quite a claim, the matriarch said after a short silence. How do I know that you're telling the truth? This could be a trap. You could be related to the people that have been sending trolls at us all this time. Honestly, I have no idea how to prove the truth of my words to you, Zorian said. Your other self was sure you would have a way to prove the authenticity of the memory packet, even without additional proof, and didn't tell me anything I could convince you with. I see, the matriarch said. She was silent for a few seconds as she thought it over. Give me access to your mind so I can see this memory packet for myself. Of course, Zorian said, offering no resistance when the matriarch delved deeper into his mind. He turned to his companion, who seemed to be at the end of her wits as she watched his silent stare down with the giant spider. Taven, I'm communicating with the spider telepathically. Everything should be fine, but if I fall to the floor and start screaming in the next few minutes, feel free to blast it to oblivion. He still had his suicide cubes with him, but it never hurt to have precautions. Taven immediately nodded at his words and Zorian saw the Urania in front of him twitch her legs uncomfortably at the implied death threat. The matriarch said nothing, too absorbed in her work. Several minutes later, the matriarch's presence retreated from his mind. I need to think about this, the matriarch said in a daze. Come back in 3 days and we'll talk. Wait, protested Zorian. I need a way to get down here without going through any of the official entrances. Otherwise I will need to bring Taven here every time I want to come down here, and I'm not sure she'll want to talk to me after this. Zorian was immediately blasted with a mental image of the local section of the tunnel system, along with 8 different ways to access it from the surface without going through any checkpoints. Wow, people weren't kidding when they said the local underworld had more holes than a sponge. In any case, that was apparently the end of his conversation with the Urania, because the spider in front of him promptly leaped into the darkness and disappeared, leaving him alone with Taven. He cast a weary glance at said girl, only to flinch at the frown she was giving him. Okay, now that the spider is gone, I guess you can explain to me what on earth I just took part in. Start talking, she commanded. Stupid Urania and their indiscretion. What the hell was he going to tell Taven now? Before we get to that, I would like to point out that if you had waited for me at the entrance like I asked you to dash. Zorian. Just saying, said Zorian lightly. Okay, here's the thing. I'm an empath. Do you know what that means? Not really, Taven said slowly. It means I can sense other people's emotions, said Zorian. And sadly, the ability is currently an instinctive ability. I have no conscious control over it, and it often causes problems for me, so I have been looking for help in mastering it. Sadly, I have found no one willing to help me on the human side, so I broaden my horizons. The spider you saw was an Urania, a sentient, telepathic species of spiders that I hope to talk into teaching me how to control my powers. Taven stared at him for a few moments, opening her mouth at one point only to simply close it soon afterwards. And what did they say? She finally asked. Taven stared at him for a few moments, opening her mouth at one point only to simply close it soon afterwards. And what did they say? She finally asked. They'll think about it, Zorian shrugged. Taven shook her head in disbelief and started walking toward the exit, motioning him to follow. Let's get out of here, monster charmer, she said. We should discuss things somewhere else. Somewhere I can sit down and have a drink. He followed. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. True to her words, Taven led him into an open-air tavern so they could sit down and relax while they talked. Well, so she could sit down and relax. Zorian didn't find the experience all that fun, especially since she made him pay for her drinks out of his own pocket. Strangely enough, Taven accepted most of his explanation without complaints, finding his decision to seek help from a species of monstrous spiders ballsy rather than reckless and stupid, but things degraded from there. She was displeased that he had originally planned to meet with the Urania without backup and wanted to know whether he had done things like that before, and who had watched his back if he had. That kick-started a heated argument about the wisdom and necessity of going solo and his ability to fight his way out should things ever go sour. Zorian honestly didn't know whether she was upset because he was putting himself in danger, or that he hadn't invited her along with him. Probably the latter, since she quickly started insisting he should take her with him next time he went into the sewers to meet the Urania matriarch. She'd only get in the way and try to get him to spill his secrets to her, so he refused. Taven didn't like that at all, but seemed to realize nothing would be gained by pressing the issue directly. Instead, she switched tracks and suggested she should help him develop his combat magic. Zorian knew this was a trap, that she simply wanted to wipe the floor with him in a friendly spar in order to show him how overmatched he was against a serious opponent, and thus be more amenable to take her along like she asked, but he agreed anyway. He was curious how long he would last against her, and he had nothing to lose except perhaps his pride. That was how he found himself facing Taven in her family training hall, fingering his rod of magic missiles and trying to decide how to approach this practice spar. The training hall was, according to Taven, heavily warded to protect people inside from spell damage, but usage of lethal spells was still not recommended. Sadly, while the ban on lethal spells was totally sensible for a spar, it completely eliminated a lot of his arsenal. He never really put much thought towards battles that weren't the kill or be killed sort, so his spell choices tended towards the destructive end of the scale. I see you invested into a spell rod, Taven said with a confident smile. Must have cost you quite a few pieces. Left unsaid, but heard loud and clear, was the implication that the money was wasted. Zorian had no chance in hell of overwhelming Taven's defenses with magic missiles, and they both knew it. That's why he didn't even intend to try. Getting into a battle of attrition with someone who had bigger mana reserves than he did was a fool's game. The prominently displayed spell rod was a deception, intended to give Taven the wrong idea about his opening moves. His real ace in the hole was the shielding bracelet hidden under his right sleeve. I made it myself, Zorian said. So it didn't cost me anything. Really? Taven said, surprised. I had no idea you were that good at spell formula. I mean, I knew you were interested in them, but... You have your talent for combat and I have mine, Zorian said smugly. He was quite pleased with himself for getting so good at spell formula. Not only was this something he had been interested in since before the time loop, it was also something that could easily ensure his financial independence once he found a way out of the time loop. Spell formula were widely known to be a difficult field to master, and experts in the field were well paid for their services. Zorian was already good enough that he could start taking commissions today if he was so inclined, and would only get better as he went through the restarts. Whatever. In the end, you are overmatched even in the equipment department, despite your fancy self-made spell rod, said Taven, stretching her hand to the side of her and causing a staff mounted on the nearby wall to fly straight into her palm. He knew it was a spell staff even before Taven channeled a burst of mana into it and caused a series of glowing yellow lines to light up across its surface. Show off, he said. He was definitely learning how to do that himself one of these days. Ready? Taven asked, pointing the staff threateningly towards him. Ready, confirmed Zorian, twirling the spell rod in his hand. Taven reacted immediately, sending a small missile swarm consisting of 5 magic missiles at him. She was fast, far faster than him, and Zorian could see in her face that she considered herself already victorious. You are way too presumptuous, Taven, he thought, raising the hand that held the spell rod in order to erect a shield in front of him while throwing a vial full of white liquid at her with his other hand. The missile swarm crashed into Zorian's shield like a hammer. If Taven had been facing old Zorian, the one that existed before the time loop, then this would have been the end. Any shield he may have erected to defend himself would have been sloppily done and would have broken like glass under the onslaught. But she wasn't. She was facing Zorian the time traveler, who had spent quite a lot of time repeating this month. Almost 2 years, by his count. In the great scheme of things, 2 years was not a huge amount of time. Nonetheless, that was still 2 years of continual combat magic practice, most of it focused on a handful of spells, including shield. His shield spell was nearly flawless. The plane of force was practically invisible when not under strain, and Zorian could overcharge it a great deal to strengthen it further. The shield held. The missile swarm crashed against it ineffectually, causing the nigh-invisible surface to turn opaque under the strain but doing little else of note. Before Taven could collect her wits and try another attack, Zorian sent a mana pulse at the vial flying towards her. The vial shattered in midair, as if crushed by some unseen fist, and a thick white smoke billowed forth from the spot as the liquid turned to gas. The vial wasn't anything special, just a simple alchemical mixture that caused coughing fits in whomever inhaled it, but it was enough to incapacitate Taven, who stumbled out of the smoke dazed and off guard. Zorian mercilessly used her moment of weakness to send a smasher straight into her torso, hoping that was the end of the fight but half expecting Taven to throw a shield at the last second to save herself. Something, perhaps his empathy, warned him to dodge when Taven suddenly thrust her staff towards the incoming missile, and by extension, him. It was a good thing he did, because she didn't cast a shield. She launched a massive battering ram of force that batted his attack aside like a snowflake and continued towards him unimpeded. Sadly, his dodge was only partial, and while he avoided the main thrust of the attack he was still caught in the outer area of effect. The attack sent him spinning like a rag doll and he soon found himself crashing headfirst into the cold, unforgiving floor of the training hall. It was probably only because of the cushioning wards in the room that he didn't end up with a cracked head or a concussion at the end of it. Since Taven seemed to be more interested in coughing her lungs out than trying to finish the fight, he remained on the floor for a while, waiting for his head to stop spinning. Apparently he made the coughing gas a bit stronger than he intended. He laboriously climbed back to his feet and walked towards the recovering Taven. "You have a very strange definition of non-lethal," he told her. "Serves you right, you cough cheater," she growled. "I got you good though, didn't I?" Zorian smiled. She huffed and swung her staff at him lightly, obviously expecting him to dodge the slow-moving object. In the interest of showing off, Zorian erected a shield instead, causing the staff to bounce off and wrench itself out of her hand. Taven looked at the shield curiously and gave it a couple of good hard knocks. The plane of force didn't even turn opaque, much less give way to her hits. "What the hell is that shield of yours made of, anyway?" Taven asked. "It took 5 missiles without breaking and it looks different. It's almost entirely transparent. I can see it only because I'm standing so close to you at the moment. Back when we were fighting, I didn't even see it until my attack hit. I thought you were trying to shield yourself with your hand or something at first. It's just a shield spell, just greatly overcharged and superbly executed," said Zorian. "I spent a lot of time practicing that spell." "Still wouldn't have helped you without that stupid trick you pulled," Taven scoffed. "This was supposed to be a spell battle, damn it." "You said you wanted to see how I fight," Zorian shrugged. "By the way, how did you know where to fire that attack of yours? You had your eyes shut pretty tight from what I could see. Oh. That's just a little trick one of my teachers taught me, Taven said. I doubt it would help you much, though. It's pretty wasteful in terms of mana usage. What do you mean? Zorian asked. Well, it's a pretty simple move that involves expelling a large quantity of mana and saturating the area around you with it. You can then sort of sense your surroundings through the resulting mana cloud. The information you gain is very rudimentary, but you can easily spot concentrated mana constructs like that magic missile you threw at me. I actually didn't know where you were, even with the aid of the mana cloud, but I figured that if I aimed in the direction from which the attack came from, I'd probably catch you as well. That sounded awfully familiar. Zorian was pretty sure he used the exact same thing for his secret unlocking trick, except that he focused more on using the mana cloud as an extension of his tactile sense rather than perceiving mana sources. Of course, there was quite the difference in scale from flooding a lock with his mana to saturating the entire greater area around him. He simply couldn't afford to be that wasteful with his mana. However, Taven, he began, let's say for a moment that I saturate a largish bubble of air around my head with this method. Would I be able to sense mana-charged marbles within that volume with this method? Taven blinked and gave him a curious look. I suppose. You'd probably have to spend some time mastering the skill to get a cloud sensitive enough to detect such low-powered sources, though. But it would be easier than trying to sense mana-charged marbles with my inborn mana sense alone, right? Zorian pressed. Way easier, Taven confirmed. Actually, just about any method would have been easier than that. Gods, you'd have to be, I don't know, Archmage level good or something to sense a mana source that weak with no spells or other aids. Zorian suddenly felt incredibly stupid. Of course Svim's task seemed impossibly difficult, he was doing it wrong. Svim probably expected him to use a method like this to sense the marbles. The asshole just didn't bother giving him proper instructions on how to go about doing it. Or any sort of instructions, for that matter. Gods, he hated that man. Following an argument about who won their little spar, Zorian claimed it was a draw. Taven claimed she totally won in the end. Taven insisted on more fights to resolve the issue, and Zorian saw no reason to refuse. He lost all subsequent fights. Of course, Taven was strong enough to simply overpower him if she so chose, and he no longer had the element of surprise on his side. Still, he felt he had done well, since Taven actually had to work to bring him down. Even she admitted that if he caught his opponent off guard and was ruthless enough in his opening moves, he could bring down even professional battle mages, though she warned that he could easily get in legal trouble that way. The Mage Guild looked very dimly on people who escalated fighting into the lethal realm, even in self-defense. And anyway, finding out what exactly Svim expected of him made the whole thing worth it all on its own. Most of the skill was already familiar to him, so it only took a few hours until he was able to create a diffuse mana cloud around his head. Granted, he couldn't really feel mana sources as such, but a marble was a physical object as well. Thus, when Friday came around and Svim unveiled his oh-so-clever training method to him, Zorian calmly identified where the marbles were going as they zipped around, and occasionally at his head. Svim wasn't impressed, of course. He simply started throwing a quick succession of marbles at him and demanded that he sort them by magnitude of mana emissions. Which he couldn't do, of course, since he was sensing them by more rudimentary means. Oh well, he wasn't too concerned. Now that he knew what to do, he fully expected to master the skill properly soon enough. Possibly by the end of the restart, unless Zack decided to tackle another dragon or something similarly insane. Fortunately, Zack's primary interest at the moment was trying to organize some kind of mother of all parties that involved inviting the entire class to his mansion during the summer festival. Being aware of the time loop, Zorian was one of the few people who understood what Zack was doing. He was trying to get as many students as possible out of harm's way without having to explain anything to them. Zorian had no idea what Zack planned to do with all those people when the attack started, or how he intended to deal with Ilsa and her insistence that everyone must attend the school dance. 3 days went by, and Zorian was back in the sewers. Finding Urania proved very easy, since they were expecting him this time. Any doubts about whether or not he was going to be taken seriously were wiped out when the forward scout he met took him to a familiar figure. The matriarch had decided to talk to him in person, rather than simply project her mind through one of her subordinates. Well, I have had time to digest the memories my other self sent me, the matriarch began. The story is not as implausible as you might think, and the memories contained some pretty damning proof. I suppose we should swap stories now, no? Of your experiences, I only know the basics you told your friends, and you know precious little of why I'm not scoffing at the idea of time travel. I suppose that would make sense, Zorian said carefully. But you want me to go first, the matriarch surmised. Very well. First thing you should know is that my web has been in a conflict with your so-called invaders for several months now. They were an infuriating, but manageable opponent, up until a week ago, when they suddenly developed a disturbing amount of precognition about our tactics and abilities. They had counters for secret skills that have been passed on from matriarch to matriarch for generations and have never been used within living memory up until that moment. They had counters for personal abilities that were unique to a single Urania. They even seemed to know how we were going to react in response to their increased threat and aggressive moves. In short, the amount of insight they possessed about us was downright implausible. Believe it or not, time travel was seriously discussed as a possible method they were using to obtain their information. Not divinations? Zorian asked. We know divinations, child, the matriarch said. If there is a field of magic beside the mind arts that we excel at, it is that. It is good that you mention divinations, though, because they hold a piece of the puzzle as well. You see, our web routinely tries to forecast the future with divination. With varying amount of success, highly disruptive events tend to make any future forecasts useless. What do you think happened when we tried to forecast the future during the past week? It didn't work, guessed Zorian. Oh, it worked. It gave wildly different results every time we repeated the forecast, no matter how little time passed between one forecast to the next, but it worked. So long as we didn't try to extend the forecast beyond the day of the summer festival. Beyond that date, the forecast returns a blank. Each and every time. It is as if everything beyond that date simply ceases to exist. Zorian swallowed heavily. He had often wondered what happened to everything when the time loop restarted itself, but had ultimately dismissed the question as unknowable. He didn't know whether to be relieved that he had no need to worry about leaving a soulless corpse in some alternate reality or disturbed that everything was literally being deleted when the time loop reset. I'm surprised I hadn't heard about that, he remarked. You'd think that some of the human oracles would have noticed something like that. You underestimate the difficulty of future forecasting, the matriarch said. It takes quite a bit of skill to read the future, and the process is time-consuming and tedious. It doesn't help that the results are often useless, or worse, misleading. And even if you do bother to forecast the future, odds are that you're only doing it for a few days at the time, since the predictions get more and more unreliable the further you try to extend the predictions. I hear complaints that such forecasts are a waste of time all the time from my fellow Urania, and our oracles can actually achieve a small measure of accuracy in their predictions. Still, I imagine you're right, there are probably human organizations that have run the forecasts and encountered the same thing, but are keeping quiet for a variety of reasons. Nobody likes a doomsayer, well, nobody of any authority, in any case. It would be nice to have independent confirmation of our findings, but I suspect few diviners would feel comfortable with sharing their secrets with a bunch of giant spiders. Perhaps if a certain young mage with an interest in divinations were to talk to them? I'll see what I can do, said Zorian. I'll give you a list of names, the matriarch said. Now how about you give us some details about the time loop and your experiences in it? Zorian gave them a basic rundown of the situation, leaving out many of the details he considered irrelevant and a tad too personal. The matriarch had only given him the bare-bones version of their story as well, so he didn't feel too bad about that. That bond between you and Zack is really inconvenient, the matriarch remarked. I don't blame you for not taking a chance with it, but are you sure you can't talk to Zack without triggering it? Who knows what useful things the boy knows about this whole thing? Surely if you inform him of your fears he will agree to keep his distance. Zorian wasn't nearly so sure. He knew Zack meant well, but he always did have problems with patience and self-control, and none of his previous encounters with the boy convinced him he'd changed all that much in that regard. Zack would have probably found another time traveler immensely fascinating and kept pushing at the boundaries until the soul bond either activated fully or was shown to be harmless. I'm surprised you haven't already ripped the knowledge from his mind, Zorian remarked. Isn't he a flicker mind? He isn't psychic, but he does have some skill in shielding his mind, the matriarch said, not at all ashamed to admit she had already tried to steal his memories. Not well, but enough that I can't do more than read his surface thoughts. Now stop dodging the question. Zorian sighed. Everything I found out about soul bonds suggests that there probably isn't any bond between me and Zack. Soul bonds tend to be really obvious to even basic detection spells. My divination instructor in one of the previous restarts showed me a spell for detecting soul bonds and I used it in school a few times. Every student with a familiar is clearly connected to their partner, and the two soul-bonded twins are also clearly bonded to each other. There is absolutely no link between me and Zack that I can see. There is no way an accidental side effect of an offensive soul mutilation spell has such sophisticated effects when even properly created soul bonds light up easily on detection spells. Curious, the matriarch said. What is it, if not a soul bond, though? Kale thinks that when the soul merge was terminated by our deaths, the link between us was cut rather than carefully untangled. As a consequence, a piece of Zack's soul ended up fused to mine, and the reverse is probably true for Zack. The control function of the time loop probably got confused at that point, and rather than decide which one of us is the real Zack decided to simply loop both of us. That would explain why Zack was absent during the first few restarts, and why he was so very sick when he finally did show up, the matriarch said. You probably both spent a number of restarts in a coma while your souls healed and integrated all the foreign bits, but he probably drew the short end of the straw when the spell was cut and ended up with far more soul damage than you. It would, agreed Zorian. And honestly, it's the most plausible explanation I've got. So why don't you want to talk to Zack, then, the matriarch asked. Oh, I see, the third time traveler. Yes. It's pretty obvious at this point that there is at least one more person inside the time loop besides me and Zack. That someone is aiding the invaders and has gods know how big of a lead on me in terms of time spent in the time loop, so I definitely don't want to catch their attention. And they know of Zack. I mean, they have to. He really isn't all that secretive about his status as a time traveler and his activities. But they aren't doing anything about it. Zack is clearly trying to fight the invaders, so why leave him unmolested? Because his actions don't matter in the long run, the matriarch guessed. From what you told me, he's trying to become strong enough to personally contest the entire invasion force. There is not much chance of that happening, even if he has all the time in the world to prepare. That, and he's possibly already been neutralized, Zorian said. I'm pretty sure that Zack is the key figure in this time travel business, the original time traveler. He has too much potential in terms of money, family legacy, mana reserves and so on. He could benefit from the whole time loop setup better than virtually anyone else, and I don't think it's accidental. Furthermore, if I am indeed in this time loop because I have a piece of Zack's soul fused to mine, that means it's him the time loop recognizes as the legitimate focus of the spell. The thing is, his past actions indicate ignorance of any sort of purpose or master plan, as if he had simply been dumped into the loop with no warning or information. You think his memories have been edited, surmised the Urania. I think Zack entrusted his secret to the wrong person, Zorian said. They couldn't just get rid of Zack, as I said, he is the key to this spell, but they could eliminate him as a threat. Shift his attention to harmless directions and such. But I'm not Zack. I am not integral to this time loop in any way, and can be disposed of at whim. If I talk to Zack, and he's being watched, or if Zack is unable to keep his mouth shut in front of the wrong people, I could end up being deleted. Well, the matriarch said. You're certainly one paranoid human. Then again, that might be the only reason why you're still in possession of your entire memory, so maybe I shouldn't talk. You do realize you're going to have to talk to Zack at some point, right? Hopefully not before I identify the third time traveler, Zorian said. Then we should make it a priority to track him down, the matriarch said. How? Zorian asked. I don't even know where to start. It could be anyone. Considering you said Zack managed to kill old Oganj single-handedly, it is clearly not anyone. He wasn't always that strong, though, Zorian pointed out. In the first few restarts, any decent mage could have overpowered him, even some of our classmates. For that matter, it could be a matter of backstabbing rather than losing in combat. Someone could have drugged him or lured him into a heavily warded trap area. Even a classmate, you say? The matriarch asked speculatively. That's interesting. Didn't you say Zack is fairly obsessed with learning more about the rest of your class? He would probably think nothing of sharing a secret with one of them, especially since they're just students. How well do you know them as a whole? Are any of them acting strange? I'm not really very close to any of them, Zorian admitted. I don't think I would know if they started to behave strange, so long as they didn't go completely out of character. I can think of a few that I'm sure aren't time travelers, but... Try to investigate, the matriarch said. It would be terribly embarrassing if it turns out the third one was hiding in plain sight all along, no? Try to see if you can connect any of them with the invaders as well. The matriarch gave Zorian a list of human diviners that might know more about the irregularities related to future forecasting, and they both agreed to meet in another 3 days. Zorian was a bit annoyed that the topic of his empathy and getting it under control never came up, but he supposed the matriarch wanted to see how useful to them he was before investing their time to teach him their, possibly secret, mind arts. It was nice having someone on his side in this whole tangled mess. He just hoped he wasn't making the same mistake with the Urania that Zack did with the person behind the invasion. Chapter 20. Orion didn't like temples. Partially it was due to his bad experiences with them as a child, but mostly due to his inability to understand the reverence with which the priesthood spoke of the vanished gods they were supposed to be venerating. Virtually every story he had read or heard about the Age of Gods made the divinities sound like gigantic jerks, so why would anyone want them back? Nobody could ever give him a satisfactory answer to that question, least of all his parents, who were religious only so long as the neighbors were watching. Although the carvings on the door were fairly stylized and disjointed, he recognized instantly what they were about. They formed a crude sort of comic, depicting a familiar story of how the world was created according to Icosians, and by extension, most religions drawing their traditions from them. According to Icosians, the world was originally a swirling, shapeless chaos, inhabited only by the 7 primordial dragons. One day, the gods descended from the higher planes of existence and killed all of them save one. This last one they refashioned into the material world that humans now inhabit, turning her body into dirt and stone, her blood into water, her breath into air and her fire into magic. The vast networks of tunnels stretching beneath the surface of the world are dragon veins, now empty of blood that had been turned into the seas but still flooded with magic emanating from the heart of the world, the fiery, still beating heart of the primordial dragon that rests somewhere deep underground. Far from being content with her fate, the dragon below still rages against her bounds, giving birth to natural disasters like volcanoes and earthquakes. Unable to strike back against the gods themselves, the dragon takes her anger out on their favored creations, humans, by utilizing her heart, the one thing the gods have not seen fit to take away from her. Pieces of it continually flake off from the main mass, giving birth to horrifying monsters whenever they hit the ground, at which point said monsters begin their ascent to the surface to terrorize mankind. And so on. Zorian didn't believe there was much truth in the old story, but the whole thing was pretty horrifying if one took it at face value. With gods like that, it was no wonder the old faiths were steadily losing converts to new religions that popped up after the gods disappeared. "Can I help you with something, young man?" Zorian wrenched himself from his musings to look at the man who spoke to him. He found himself facing a young, green-haired man in priestly robes. The man's relaxed posture and friendly smile set Zorian at ease, but he couldn't help but wonder about that green hair. As far as Zorian knew, the only people who naturally had green hair were members of House Reed, and it seemed rather out of character for one of them to go into clergy. That particular house was infamous for their links to crime syndicates. "Maybe," allowed Zorian. "I am Zorian Kaczynski, mage in training. I was wondering whether Priestess Kylie was around and willing to talk to me?" "Oh, and sorry about worrying you. I suppose I had been staring at the entrance a little too long." Junior Priest Batak, the man introduced himself. "And don't worry, a lot of people are intimidated by the gates. It's why I like to greet newcomers personally like this. As for Kylie, well, she is currently in the middle of a ritual, but if you're willing to wait an hour or so I'm sure she'll be happy to hear you out." "Sure," Zorian agreed. This was far better than he expected. To be honest, he half expected the man to put him through some kind of religious test before allowing him to see the head priestess. Waiting an hour or two was a minor price to pay really. So should I come back later or?" "Nonsense," the man scoffed. "Come inside and I'll make us something to drink while we wait. It'll be nice to have someone new to chat with for a change. We get so few visitors these days." Uh-oh. It seemed that he might still end up being subjected to a test, only this one in the form of casual conversation instead of something overt. "Slow week?" Zorian asked as they entered the temple. The interior was pleasantly cool and fairly dark, with rays of multicolored light streaming down from several high-placed stained glass windows, as well as totally empty. He was grateful for the lack of crowds, but it was unusual to see a temple completely deserted like this. "I wish," Batak sighed. He led Zorian through rows and rows of wooden benches that filled the temple's main hall, his steps echoing hauntingly behind him. More like a slow decade. The aftermath of the weeping has not been kind to this place. n/o/vel/b/n.c/n.c/om. "What do you mean?" Zorian asked. "What does the weeping have to do with this place?" Batak gave him a judging glance before sighing heavily. Though the gods have gone silent, the priesthood has never been completely powerless. Most priests have some skill with magic, and higher ranks can usually call upon the aid of angels and other lesser spiritual entities, but our real claim to authority came from various hidden mysteries that were entrusted to us before the gods departed to the unknown. Over time a lot of those were stolen or otherwise lost, but the one thing where we were always unmatched was the healing arts. As such, when the weeping plague started spreading across the lands like wildfire, we were expected to do something about it. Sadly, not only were we as powerless against it as anyone else, our close contact with the infected quickly resulted in massive casualties within our ranks. With the subsequent shortage of qualified priests, peripheral temples like this one were all but abandoned, both by believers and by the Holy Triumvirate. Zorian looked around him, but failed to see any evidence of decay in the interior of the temple. The temple was clean and intact, and the altar, made out of white marble and framed with silk or some other expensive cloth, looked practically brand new. Plenty of stone statues were scattered throughout the building, seamlessly melding into the walls or support beams, and most of the remaining unadorned space was taken up by wooden panels that had various religious imagery carved into their surface, much like the main doors. In short, it was an absurdly luxurious building by the standards of rural temples such as the one in Siren, and better maintained to boot. Zorian was almost afraid to ask what Sayoria's main temple looked like if this one was not considered important enough to keep running. Batak led him to a small, unassuming door next to the altar and ushered him to what was apparently a more informal setting. Rather than being a classical office, it was instead a combination of a kitchen and a living room, far messier than and not nearly as lifeless as the main temple had been. Batak immediately started preparing some tea and started peppering him with questions. The questions were fairly standard: who he was, what he did, where he was from, who his family was, that sort of stuff, so Zorian felt comfortable answering them honestly. Strangely enough, Batak didn't ask him a single question about his religiosity, something Zorian was glad for. Zorian, in turn, asked a couple of questions about Batak and Kylie, trying to understand what they were even doing here if the temple was abandoned. Batak was all too happy to enlighten him. Apparently the church leadership didn't feel comfortable with simply demolishing the temple, or worse, leaving it to the mercy of the elements and looters. A perfectly understandable sentiment, in Zorian's opinion. Not only would it be a shame to consign such a majestic building to oblivion, it would also be a blatant admission of weakness from the church. In the end, Batak and Kylie were assigned to the temple, ostensibly to keep the temple running but in reality more to keep it presentable and ward off thieves and squatters. Finally, after he finished his cup of tea, Batak finally decided he had danced around the issue long enough. "So," said Batak, "you never did tell me why you're here, Mr. Kaczynski. Do you think you could perhaps tell me what you need to speak with Kylie about, or is this too sensitive for the ears of a mere junior priest?" Zorian thought about it for a second before deciding it probably wouldn't hurt to tell the man why he came. Future forecasting wasn't illegal or anything, after all. "Well," began Zorian. "For a start, I heard that Priestess Kylie is skilled at forecasting the future through divinations." Batak stiffened slightly, but quickly forced himself to relax. His smile did slip off his face, however. "She is," he said. "It is a difficult field to practice and I doubt anyone could claim mastery of it in any real sense, but she is as close to an expert as you're likely ever going to get. But there are other people who dabble in it regardless, one of which has sent me to speak with Kylie about her findings," said Zorian, privately enjoying the mental image of the Urania matriarch hissing at him for calling her a dabbler in the field. Some of the results she had gotten out of her predictions have been very irregular. All pretenses of good cheer had left Batak's face by the time he finished talking. Silence stretched into uncomfortable seconds. Zorian was starting to wonder if talking about the topic was somehow taboo or if he had otherwise insulted the man somehow when the junior priest spoke again. "And these irregularities, when exactly do they appear? How far did your mysterious backer project her predictions before they went haywire?" It was at this point that Zorian realized Batak already knew. He was no more a mere junior priest than Zorian was just an innocent messenger. There is only one real irregularity, and it appears on the day of the summer festival. Specifically, the prediction returns a blank beyond that date, almost as if the whole world disappears after that point. "But you already knew that, didn't you?" asked Zorian rhetorically. Instead of answering him, Batak spat out a very unpriestly curse and started pacing around the cramped room in agitation. "I'll take that as a yes," Zorian sighed. Batak stopped pacing to give him a wary look. After a few moments, the priest visibly forced himself to relax. "I'm sorry," said Batak, "I didn't mean to be rude, it's just, well, it's probably best if I go and fetch Kylie now so we can discuss this together." I'm sorry, said Batak, I didn't mean to be rude, it's just, well, it's probably best if I go and fetch Kylie now so we can discuss this together. Isn't she doing a ritual at the moment? Zorian pointed out curiously. He knew it was a very bad idea to stop magical rituals halfway through, but maybe the ritual Kylie was performing was purely religious in nature? Well, sort of, Batak said sheepishly. I don't think she'll be terribly bothered if I interrupt her. Not for this, in any case. Please wait here while I go get her. As Zorian watched Batak hurriedly leave, he couldn't help but wonder why Batak was so spooked out by the termination date they uncovered. Zorian was certainly spooked, but that was because he knew exactly what was causing it, but to Batak and Kylie it shouldn't look terribly unusual. Much like soul-related magics, the field of future prediction was very poorly understood, and strange never-encountered events probably weren't unheard of. Zorian sincerely hoped that Batak's agitation meant they knew something important about the anomaly that he and Arania Matriarch had missed. It wasn't long before Batak came back with a middle-aged woman back in tow. Zorian's first thought was that she was surprisingly young for a high priestess, but he supposed with the manpower shortage among the priesthood they couldn't afford to be too picky about such things. For her part, the priestess gave him a long, searching look upon entering the room before giving him a strained smile and sitting down next to Batak, so that both of them were facing him. "Hello Mr. Kaczynski," she said. "I am Kylie Kwosi, the high priestess of this temple. I hear you've wanted to speak to me. Specifically, that you wanted to speak to me about future prediction? About the termination date on the day of the summer festival, yes," Zorian confirmed. A short exchange followed where they both confirmed they were indeed talking about the same thing, and then the priestess leaned back on her chair and gave Batak a mild glare. "I told you it was not a mistake," she said. "And I told you it wasn't you who was the problem," Batak shot back. "I guess we were both right." Kylie sighed before refocusing on Zorian. "I don't suppose you could introduce me to your master so I can discuss this directly with her? Not that I have anything against you, but you just don't have the necessary expertise and all your information is by necessity second-hand." "Sorry," Zorian said. "I'm afraid my master definitely wishes to stay hidden. I agree she could help you better in person, but this is how things are at the moment. And it was vanishingly unlikely that would change any time soon. According to current church dogma, Arania were classified as monsters, servants of the dragon below, to be precise, and therefore not to be dealt with." Kylie and Batak seemed fairly liberal as priests go, but probably not that liberal. Admitting he was speaking on behalf of a giant sentient spider would have led to him being forcibly expelled from the temple at best. "If I may ask, though, why has this gotten you so spooked?" Zorian asked curiously. "I mean, I know why me and my master are concerned, but why do you have a problem with it?" The priestess looked at him curiously. "And why are you concerned, if I may ask?" "Trade," offered Zorian, suppressing a smile in favor of a most innocent expression he could manage. "Hook, line, and sinker." The priestess shared a silent look with Batak, somehow communicating without words with her fellow priest. Apparently they knew each other quite well if they could manage that. Maybe they were lovers? If Zorian remembered correctly, priests were forbidden to have relationships with each other, and thus had to look for romantic options outside the church hierarchy, but it wouldn't be the first time such rules were ignored. In any case, after a few seconds they seemed to reach a decision and turned again towards him. "We will share our concerns with you, but only if you go first," the priestess said. "And be warned, I can tell when people lie to me. It is a supernatural ability and has never failed me before, so please don't waste my time with lies and half-truths." Well, that was kind of inconvenient. Zorian didn't detect any attempt at barging into his mind, so whatever ability she had probably wasn't mind-based in nature. Was she instinctively divining the truth of his statements? Peering into his soul? He supposed she could be bluffing, but he somehow doubted it. In the end, he decided to take a risk. He fired off a couple of divinations to make sure they weren't scryed and that there were no cranium rats around, and then started to speak when they returned negative. Let's see if this will be a sufficient price for your help, then, Zorian sighed. The reason we're concerned is that there is a well-funded, well-organized group of terrorists planning to take advantage of the summer festival to cause trouble. Some parts of their plan, like their usage of artillery spells and war trolls smuggled through the dungeon, was fairly pedestrian. But there is a more exotic component to their plans, one that wreaks havoc with future prediction by its very nature. There was a brief moment of silence as the two priests stared at him incredulously. "That is not what I expected to hear," the priestess said. "Gods and goddesses, this is way above my pay grade. I don't think I want to know more, to be honest. I don't want to get involved into such things." "Probably for the best," Zorian agreed. "If that is indeed the true cause of the irregularity, though, then my own reasons to panic about it are largely misplaced," the priestess mused. "I'd still like to hear about it, if it's not a problem," Zorian said. "It's about the angels," Batak interjected. "Ever since the gods have gone silent, angels have sort of taken their place. They can't grant magical powers to the priesthood or work miracles the way gods could, but they can be summoned in order to provide advice or give aid with their considerable personal abilities." "And what did they say about the anomaly that got you so spooked?" Zorian asked curiously. "That's the thing," the priestess sighed. "We can't ask them because no one has been able to summon them since about a week ago. We've been in contact with churches as far as Koth, and they report the same thing. Even the most approachable of celestials are ignoring us. Hell, I've even heard rumors that demon worshippers cannot contact their vile masters anymore. It is as if something has cut the entire material plane off from the spiritual realms." Zorian swallowed heavily. "A week ago, the start of the time loop obviously." "Quite disturbing, isn't it?" said Kylie. "Coupled with the timeline simply cutting off a few weeks from now, well, I must admit it had really gotten me spooked. Finding out the two are basically unrelated certainly makes me rest easier." There was further conversation after this, but none of it was terribly productive. He promised Batak and Kylie to be discreet about their troubles with contacting the spirit world and left. Unlike the priestess, Zorian didn't feel like the conversation had eased his worries. ******. Following his visit to the temple, Zorian decided to sit down in one of the many restaurants scattered throughout the city and consider this new information with a bit of food and drink. There was no doubt in his mind that the severing of the link between the spiritual planes and the material one was caused by the time loop, but what that meant was less clear. Was the material plane the only one experiencing the time loop, isolated from everything else within some kind of time bubble? The fact that his current timeline seemed to literally end when the time loop restarted strongly suggested this. Apparently the spell wasn't snatching up a bunch of souls and putting them into their past bodies like he initially assumed, it was literally rewinding time itself in the targeted area while leaving a couple of souls intact in the process. No wonder the spell was so easily transmissible. Compared to reverting everything 1 month into the past, the cost of looping an additional soul or two was probably utterly inconsequential. And that, if true, was very disturbing. That was not human magic. 100 or so mages in possession of a mana well and a whole lot of time to prepare could affect a medium-sized country at most. The time loop must have enveloped the whole continent, at least, for the boundary to have not been noticed after a day or two. News spread fast these days. And frankly, Zorian had a hunch the time loop enveloped the entire planet. This was like something straight out of the Age of Gods, but if higher beings were involved, why was the time loop allowed to go off its intended course so severely? His musings were interrupted by the scraping of a nearby chair. Someone had decided to join him. "Oh," he said. It's you. Is that the way to greet a friend, Roach? Taven complained. Zorian rolled his eyes at her. Hi, Taven, he said blandly. Fancy seeing you here. I mean, this place is pretty far from your usual haunts. It's almost as if you decided to track me down to this place. That's because I did, Taven said. What are you doing on the edge of the city, anyway? I was visiting a temple nearby, Zorian answered. Lovely architecture. You, visiting temples? Taven scoffed. Zorian said nothing. Fine, be that way. I won't pry. In case you're wondering, I'm here because I asked around to see if I could find a human empath that could help you control your powers. You did? Asked Zorian, suddenly a lot more alert and enthusiastic about this conversation. Taven smiled sheepishly. I kind of did find someone willing to help you, but I'm not sure whether it's something you're willing to go for. The woman in question is a healer in one of Sayoria's big hospitals, and she's only willing to teach you if you agree to an apprentice contract with her and become a full-blown healer. Zorian clacked his tongue in disappointment. He did intend to learn the basics of magical healing at some point in the future, but that was a long way off. Learning medicine wasn't something you do in your spare time and would doubtlessly require him to dedicate most of the restart on mastering that one field. He had too many things on his plate as it was. No, that doesn't work for me at all, Zorian sighed. I have nothing against healers, but that's not the career I'm aiming for.
Yeah,
I kind of figured, Taven said. It really would be kind of a shame to let all that work you sank into spell formulas go to waste. I guess the spiders are still your best bet, huh?
Yeah,
agreed Zorian. Although, to tell the truth, they have been dragging their many feet in regard to teaching me. Maybe if they thought I actually had valid alternatives to their help they'd hurry up a little? What was the healer's name, anyway? Taven narrowed her eyes. You've been down there alone again?
uh-oh.
Maya Abe. She reached out across the table and cuffed him in the shoulder. It hurt. Zorian, you moron, she complained. I told you not to do these things alone. Even if you trust the freaky giant spiders that much, and I don't really think you should, there are other things down there. Not matter how capable you are, it's always smart to have another set of hands and eyes with you. Unless you think I couldn't keep up with you? I don't think that at all, Zorian said. I just didn't want to be a bother and... I already said I don't mind helping, Taven cut him off. You can't use that as an excuse. And the Arania are kind of prejudiced against non-psychic people, finished Zorian. Non-what? Asked Taven incredulously. Psychic. People who are like me and them. I don't quite have a comprehensive explanation what being psychic entails, but it seems to be some kind of instinctive affinity for mind magic. That's where my empathy apparently comes from. The Arania claim it's a weak form of mind reading, and that I could actually do more once they actually deign to teach me. Taven seemed at a loss for words for a moment. You're reading my mind, she finally said. I didn't give you permission to do that. I'm only getting vague impressions of your emotions, and not even that consistently, said Zorian with a long-suffering sigh. Besides, that's why I'm meeting with the Arania, to learn how to not do that unless I want to. How did you think empathy works, anyway? I guess I didn't, admitted Taven. But we're getting off track. Why does me not being psychic matter to your new spidery friends? How should I know? Prejudices rarely make much sense. Well, go ahead and ask them the next time you see them. Taven said. Because if you can't give me a proper answer the next time I ask, I'm going down there to ask them myself, with or without your permission. It's total bullshit. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Aside from his visit to the temple, none of the other future forecasters were in any way helpful to Zorian. A fair number of them didn't even want to talk to him, and those that did hadn't made long-term predictions and hadn't noticed anything strange. Well, one of them did claim to have done so and found nothing of note, but he was an obvious fraud and spent most of the talk trying to get Zorian to part with his money in exchange for a more detailed reading of the future. So Zorian turned to the matter of his classmates and the possibility that one of them was the third time traveler. Zorian didn't think there was much chance of that, but better safe than sorry. Besides, it was a good way to look for clues as far as he was concerned, and he had been thinking of getting to know his classmates better anyway. Including him, there were exactly 20 people in Zorian's class, 12 girls and 8 boys. Of those, there were 3 people he was almost certain weren't the third time traveler, Akoja, Benasek and Kale. The first 2 because he actually knew what their normal behavior and personality were before the time loop and had interacted extensively enough with the both of them in various restarts to judge them unchanged, and Kale because of the events that took place in the previous restart. Trying to write down everything he knew about the rest, he quickly found 2 classmates that were very suspicious, Tinami Aope and Eston Greer. Noble House Aope had a very shady reputation. The house began its existence during the Witch Wars, when one of the major witch clans agreed to defect to the Icosians' side if they were given the status of a formal house in return. The Icosians, ever pragmatic, agreed. No doubt they thought they could milk the renegades for their magical secrets and then quietly sideline them until they could be officially removed, but that never happened. Instead, the Aope rose through the ranks of the Icosian political system, leaving a trail of broken rivals in their wake, until they eventually stood on top as one of the more prestigious noble houses in all Altazia. This extreme success wasn't a result of just being very competent politicians, though Aope were rumored to practice all sorts of dark, forbidden magic stemming from their witchy roots. Necromancy, demon summoning, mind magic. Of course, this was all just a rumor. Certainly no one who valued their life and career would ever suggest that Tinami Aope, the firstborn daughter of the current head of Aope household, was practicing forbidden magics. Perish the thought. And in fact, the girl was painfully shy and withdrawn and in general looked like she wouldn't hurt a fly. That didn't prove anything, though. Beware of the quiet ones and all that. If there was one person in the class who had easy access to magics that could screw Zack over and hijack the time loop for their own ends, it was probably Tinami. Even better, her withdrawn nature would ensure that very few people knew her enough to realize she was acting strangely unless she did something totally crazy. Eston Greer, the second suspect, was primarily suspicious because of where he came from. He and his family had immigrated to Altazia from Ulquinabesa, the infamous island of the exiles. Since the island was populated mostly by mages exiled there in the wake of the Necromancer's War, that made Eston the second person who could plausibly have access to forbidden magics without too much trouble. Also, Zorian was fairly certain that the mages leading the invasion force came primarily from Ulquinabesa. The island was one of the few places where one could find enough necromancers and war trolls to explain the numbers of them present at the invasion. It was also the last recorded home of Quatakitl, the Lich general that fought the Old Alliance in the Necromancer's War and whose physical description matched almost exactly with the Lich that had so thoroughly trounced Zack in that fateful battle where Zorian was dragged into the time loop. Of course, those 2 were only the obvious suspects, and the third time traveler, if indeed present among his classmates, was no doubt far more cunningly hidden. Realizing he didn't know enough about people in his class to really make a judgment, Zorian decided to seek the aid of the one person who could no doubt tell him something about everyone. "Hello Benasek," Zorian said, sitting next to the chubby, talkative boy. "Can I ask you to do me a favor?" "Sure," Benasek said. "What do you need?" "I need basic information about everyone in our class. What's the latest gossip about them and so forth?" Asterisk asterisk asterisk. "Well, that is certainly an interesting turn of events," the matriarch remarked. A confirmation of the cutoff point in the timeline and another clue as to the true nature of this time loop is far more than I had hoped for. I must admit I hadn't actually expected you to find anything useful among human diviners, but there you go. I don't suppose you have anything on your classmates yet? Not really, Zorian responded. I'm only starting with the investigation. Truthfully, this is bound to be a task spanning numerous restarts, so you shouldn't expect quick results. Yes, of course. Well, I have nothing else to add, so unless you have any additional questions we can meet each other next week to check on each other's progress. Actually, I have 2 questions, said Zorian. Ask away, then. First question, can you explain to me what exactly you mean by flicker mind and why you disdain them so much? Zorian asked. You keep saying that word and it sounded terribly insulting and bigoted. The matriarch twitched her legs, emitting some complex emotion that Zorian couldn't decode with his limited empathic abilities. That tended to happen a lot, actually, since the Urania were so thoroughly different from humans in both body and mind. I apologize if we offend, she finally said. It had been quite a while since we had a real, sustained contact with a human, and there are bound to be misunderstandings and points of contention. I notice you didn't actually answer my question, pointed out Zorian. It is like you suspect, a flicker mind is a creature that isn't psychic like you and me. I'm sure they can be wonderful people, but I, as well as most of my fellow Urania, find it hard to truly take them seriously. It's like meeting a society of people that are born blind. They can obviously manage without sight, but you'd probably still consider them fundamentally crippled. You never did tell me what being psychic entails, you know? Zorian pointed out. Everything, from the smallest grain of sand to the very gods themselves, is connected through the great invisible web that suffuses all creation, the matriarch said. Psychic people are open to these connections, and contact the minds of others, or even the universe itself, to perform what you humans call magic. That explanation sounds almost religious, said Zorian. The great invisible web does feature prominently in our spirituality, the matriarch admitted. What was the other question you wanted to ask me about? Yes. I had found a human empath that might be willing to teach me some of her skills. I wanted to ask you for your opinion. No, the matriarch interrupted. That's a terrible idea. Your human empaths are bad teachers. Their training consists of nothing but showing people how to shut off their link to the great web and keep it closed most of the time. They brainwash their students into believing that sensing emotions is all there is to their powers and that the rest of the mind arts are immoral. They make a mockery of the great gift. Zorian blinked in shock. He had intended to produce a reaction by broaching the topic in question, but he had no idea the matriarch would be affected this strongly. Anger and outrage simply poured off the matriarch, making it clear that she cared about this issue very, very much. For the first time since his first encounter with her, he remembered that she was actually quite a terrifying creature. That's a lot stronger denunciation than I expected, Zorian admitted, forcing himself to remain calm. Care to suggest an alternative, then? I really want to get this ability under control. Have I not promised to help you with that? The matriarch asked. And then you ignored the issue completely, Zorian answered. I thought you needed time to come to terms with it. You didn't exactly act thrilled when I first informed you of your gifts. Maybe if you hadn't waited 6 months before contacting me we would have been on the same wavelength. Ouch. But no matter, the matriarch said, this whole argument is pointless. If you want to learn how to use your gift effectively, I'll be happy to help. Come back tomorrow at this time and we can begin with your lessons. She turned to leave before pausing and sending him one final parting burst of communication. And then, once you experience the great web in its full glory, you can go to that human empath and see for yourself who is right.